The valley was death incarnate, a jagged wound carved into the Afghan highlands where the sun fell like molten brass and shadows pooled thick as blood. Somewhere in that labyrinth of stone and silence, 6 Navy SEALs crouched behind a shattered wall, their ammunition dwindling like hope itself. They had been running for 3 days. The Taliban knew these mountains the way a man knows the scars on his own hands, and they were closing in with the patience of wolves. Overhead, the sky stretched empty and indifferent, a canvas of burning blue that offered no salvation. The SEALs had called for air support twice. Twice they'd been told to wait. Wait while the enemy tightened the noose. Wait while their brothers bled into the dust. Wait while the world forgot they existed. Then at 1300 hours something changed. The radio crackled with a voice that didn't belong to any controller they recognized. It was calm, almost too calm, like someone reading poetry to a dying man. Viper 2-1, this is Reaper 6. I have eyes on your position. Stay low. The team leader, Lieutenant Marcus Keene, pressed his back against the stone and keyed his mic with a bloodied hand. Reaper 6, we are danger close to enemy positions. I repeat, danger close. Who the hell is Reaper 6? There was a pause, long enough for Keene to wonder if the transmission had been a fever dream. Then the voice returned, edged now with something that might have been a smile. Reaper 6 is inbound. 1 minute out. You're going to want to cover your ears. The SEALs exchanged glances. No one had mentioned close air support. No one had mentioned anything except a possible extraction at nightfall, and nightfall was 6 hours away. 6 hours they didn't have. Keene crawled to the edge of the wall and risked a glance at the ridgeline. At least 40 fighters were moving through the rocks, spread out in a crescent formation that would collapse on them like a fist. He could see the glint of RPG tubes, the dark outlines of PKM machine guns. They were professionals, not the ragtag militias the media loved to portray. These men knew how to fight, and they knew how to kill. Then he heard it. Not the high whine of an F-16 or the thunder of a B-1 bomber, but something lower, meaner, a sound like the earth itself grinding its teeth. It grew louder, rising from the southern pass, and Keene's heart lurched because he recognized that sound from another lifetime, from another war that had never really ended. It was the sound of 30 millimeters of rotary cannon preparing to sing. The A-10 Thunderbolt came over the ridge at 300 feet, and it came alone. No wingman, no backup, just one aircraft battered and scarred, its titanium bathtub belly reflecting the sun like a promise kept. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in its nose was a weapon from another era, designed to punch through Soviet tank armor, and it protruded from the fuselage like the tusk of some prehistoric predator. The aircraft banked hard, exposing its underside, and Keene could see the squadron markings, faded but unmistakable. The 354th Fighter Squadron. The Bulldogs. He'd heard stories about them, the kind of stories that got told in bars after too many drinks, tales of pilots who flew missions no one else would take, who loitered over battlefields until their fuel gauges screamed, who treated danger close like a suggestion rather than a rule. Reaper 6, rifles hot, mark your position with smoke. The voice on the radio was still calm, still measured, as if orchestrating a chess game rather than a massacre. Keene pulled a smoke grenade from his vest, the purple canister slick with sweat and grime, and lobbed it into the clearing 20 meters ahead. Purple smoke billowed up, thick and acrid, a beacon in the wilderness. "Smoke out, purple smoke," Keene transmitted, his voice hoarse from 3 days of shouting and dust. Enemy force on ridgeline spread along the northern approach. They're dug in deep. Copy smoke. Beginning gun run. Keep your heads down, gentlemen, this is going to be loud. The A-10 rolled inverted for a heartbeat, a maneuver that seemed to defy physics and common sense, then dove. The descent was steep, almost suicidal, the kind of angle that would tear the wings off a lesser aircraft. But the Warthog held together because that's what it was built to do. It was a flying gun platform, ugly and inelegant, designed not to inspire awe but to deliver violence with surgical precision. The Taliban fighters on the ridge saw it coming. Some tried to run. Most froze, their minds unable to process what their eyes were telling them. And then the gun fired. The sound was apocalyptic. Not a rattle or a roar, but a deep, guttural brrrrt that seemed to originate from the core of the planet. The GAU-8 spat 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second, each projectile capable of punching through concrete, metal, flesh, bone. The ridgeline erupted in geysers of pulverized stone and mist that wasn't mist at all. The first pass lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds of sustained fire that transformed the Taliban position into a crater. Bodies disappeared. Weapons disintegrated. The mountain itself seemed to recoil from the onslaught. They pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing the pilot into the seat and banked for another run. Keane watched through the haze of smoke and dust, his mouth dry, his pulse hammering. He'd called in airstrikes before, had seen Hellfire missiles obliterate targets from miles away, but this was different. This was personal. This was someone choosing to fly into hell because 6 men needed help. Viper 2-1, how's your southern flank? The pilot's voice crackled through, still calm, still unhurried. Keane spun, scanning the terrain. The southern approach had been quiet, but now he could see movement, fighters repositioning, trying to flank them while the northern group was being annihilated. We've got movement south, maybe a dozen. They're trying to circle behind us. There was no hesitation. Copy, adjusting. The A-10 came around in a wide arc, losing altitude until it seemed to skim the tops of the rocks. This time the angle was different, the approach shallower, and Keane realized the pilot was threading the aircraft between 2 ridges, using the terrain to mask the approach. It was insane. It was brilliant. The Taliban fighters never saw it coming. The gun spoke again, a shorter burst this time, more controlled, and the southern flank evaporated in a storm of fire and steel. 3 more times the A-10 made its runs, each pass calculated, each burst devastating. The pilot moved with a precision that bordered on artistry, carving through enemy positions like a sculptor, removing everything that wasn't victory. The SEALs stayed low, their bodies pressed against the earth, feeling each thunderous salvo through the ground itself. When the 5th pass was complete, the radio crackled again. Viper 2-1, I'm Winchester, out of ammunition, but I've got 30 minutes of fuel left. I'll orbit overhead, keep eyes on you until your exfil arrives. Keane's throat tightened. Winchester, combat pilot slang for out of ammo. The A-10 had emptied every round, expended every weapon, and now it would stay, a guardian with no teeth, circling above them as a psychological deterrent. Because sometimes presence was as powerful as firepower. Reaper 6, who are you? Keane asked, the question barely more than a whisper. The pause was longer this time. When the voice returned, it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Someone who knows what it's like to wait for help that never comes. The transmission ended, and the A-10 continued its slow, deliberate orbit, a metal angel watching over the valley of death. The SEALs used the lull to regroup, to check their wounded, to breathe for the first time in hours. Keane stared up at the circling aircraft, its silhouette black against the relentless sun, and wondered about the pilot. The call sign, Reaper 6, meant nothing to him. But the skill, the courage, the willingness to come alone into a valley of 40 fighters, that meant everything. 20 minutes later, the extraction helicopter arrived, a Black Hawk flanked by 2 Apache. The crew chief helped load the wounded, his face grim but professional. As the helicopter lifted off, Keane looked back one last time. The A-10 was still there, still circling, and he raised a hand in salute even though he knew the pilot couldn't see him. The aircraft dipped its wings once, a gesture of acknowledgement, then turned south and disappeared into the mountains. It would be 3 days before Keane learned the truth. 3 days before he sat in a debriefing room at Bagram Airfield and heard the name for the first time. Captain Jeline Reaper Kestrel, 34 years old, 12 years of service, 217 combat missions, and a reputation that preceded her like a storm. The operations officer, a balding colonel with a chest full of ribbons, leaned back in his chair and studied Keane with tired eyes. You got lucky, he said, tapping a file on the desk. Reaper doesn't fly rescue missions anymore. Command won't let her. Too many close calls, too many rule violations. She's supposed to be flying training sorties out of Kandahar. Keen frowned. Then how did she end up over our position? The colonel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was returning from a cargo escort when she intercepted your distress call, decided to divert without authorization. Command is furious. She's looking at disciplinary action, maybe a grounding. Keene felt something cold settle in his gut. She saved our lives. I know, the colonel said quietly, and that's the only reason she's not already court-martialed. The story should have ended there, with paperwork and bureaucracy smothering heroism under a mountain of regulations. But stories like this don't end. They metastasize. They find cracks in the official narrative and spread like wildfire through the ranks. Within a week, every pilot in theater knew about the lone A-10 that had engaged 40 fighters to save 6 SEALs. Within 2 weeks, the story had reached the States, whispered in ready rooms and training squadrons, embellished and mythologized until it was hard to separate fact from legend. And at the center of it all was a name that most people had never heard but would never forget: Reaper. But who was she? That was the question on everyone's lips, the mystery that made the story irresistible. Because Jalene Kestrel wasn't supposed to exist, not in the way the Air Force wanted its heroes to exist. She didn't fit the mold. She was too rough around the edges, too scarred by experience, too willing to break the rules when the rules got people killed. Her service record read like a cautionary tale, a litany of reprimands and commendations that seemed to cancel each other out. Insubordination, reckless endangerment, unauthorized deviations from flight plans, but also 17 successful combat rescues, 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, more close air support missions than any other pilot in her squadron. She was a contradiction, a paradox wrapped in a flight suit, and the Air Force didn't know what to do with her. Her call sign told part of the story: Reaper. It hadn't been her choice. Call signs never were. They were earned, usually through humiliation or some memorable screw-up that your squadron mates could mock you with for the rest of your career. But Jalene's call sign came from a different place, a darker place. It was given to her after her 3rd deployment, after a mission over Helmand Province where she had stayed on station for 6 hours, far beyond her fuel reserves, protecting a Marine company that was pinned down by insurgent fire. She had made 11 gun runs that day, expending every round, every missile, until the A-10 was running on fumes and prayers. The Marines had nicknamed her the Reaper because she had harvested death from the sky with a methodical, almost serene efficiency. The name stuck, and over time it evolved, taking on layers of meaning that even Jalene herself didn't fully understand. To understand Jalene Kestrel, you had to go back before the deployments and the medals and the disciplinary hearings, back to a small town in Montana where the sky was so big it felt like falling upward just to look at it. She grew up on a cattle ranch, the youngest of 3 daughters, in a family where hard work wasn't a virtue but a necessity. Her father was a Vietnam veteran, a helicopter pilot who had flown medevac missions in the Mekong Delta and came home with a Purple Heart and nightmares that never quite faded. He didn't talk much about the war, but sometimes, late at night when the Montana wind howled through the eaves, Jalene would hear him packing in the living room, reliving missions that should have stayed buried. She learned 2 things from her father: that some people were called to serve, and that service always exacted a price. Jalene's path to the Air Force wasn't romantic. She didn't grow up dreaming of fighter jets or dogfights. She wanted to be a veterinarian, maybe take over the ranch someday, live a quiet life under that vast Montana sky. But her father died when she was 19, a heart attack in the middle of calving season, and the ranch couldn't sustain itself on his veteran's pension and her mother's part-time teaching salary. Jalene's older sisters had families of their own, responsibilities that kept them anchored elsewhere. So at 20, Jalene enlisted, figuring she'd do 4 years, save some money, send it home to keep the ranch afloat. She scored high on the aptitude tests, high enough that a recruiter with sharp eyes and sharper instincts suggested she apply for officer training school. She did. She excelled. And when they asked what airframe she wanted to fly, she chose the A-10 without hesitation because it reminded her of her father's stories, of helicopters flying low and slow into the fire to save lives. Flight school was a crucible. The washout rate was high and the instructors had little patience for weakness or self-doubt. Jeline thrived, not because she was naturally gifted. There were pilots with better reflexes, sharper eyes, smoother hands on the stick, but because she was relentless. She studied until her eyes burned. She practiced maneuvers until they became muscle memory. She absorbed every lesson, every critique, every failure and turned it into fuel. Her classmates respected her, but they didn't understand her. She wasn't there to chase glory or prove anything to anyone. She was there because 600 miles away, a ranch was dying and every paycheck she earned was a lifeline thrown across the distance. When she graduated, ranked 7th in her class, the commandant shook her hand and told her she'd make a fine pilot. He had no idea how right he was, or how much it would cost her. Her first deployment was Iraq, during the tail end of the surge. She flew convoy escort missions mostly, boring hours of circling over dusty roads, watching for IEDs and ambushes that rarely materialized. The veterans in her squadron called it armed overwatch with a good soundtrack, and they weren't wrong. But Jeline paid attention. She studied the terrain, memorized every wadi and road junction, learned to read the patterns of civilian movement the way a hunter reads tracks. When the ambushes did come, she was ready. Her first gun run was almost clinical in its execution. 2 vehicles disabled, insurgents scattered, convoy safe. The ground commander praised her over the radio, and Jeline felt nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, just the mechanical certainty that she had done her job. It was only later, back at base, sitting alone in her quarters, that the weight of it hit her. She had killed people. They were enemy combatants, threats to American lives, but they were still people. And she had erased them with a 3-second burst from a gun that fired faster than the human mind could process. She didn't sleep that night, or the next, but by the third night something in her had shifted. She realized that guilt was a luxury she couldn't afford. The men and women on the ground didn't need her to agonize over moral complexities. They needed her to show up, to bring the fire, to go home. So she compartmentalized. She built walls inside herself, partitions between the person she was and the weapon she needed to be. It worked after a fashion. She flew more missions, racked up more combat hours, earned a reputation as someone you wanted overhead when things went sideways. But the walls didn't hold forever. They never do. Her second deployment was Afghanistan, and that's where everything changed. The mountains were different from the deserts of Iraq, more vertical, more claustrophobic, and the enemy fought with a ferocity that bordered on suicidal. Jeline's squadron was based at Bagram, flying daily sorties over the Hindu Kush, supporting ground operations that seemed to blur together into an endless cycle of violence and futility. She was assigned to a forward operating base in the Korangal Valley, a place so dangerous it was nicknamed the Valley of Death by the soldiers who patrolled it. The casualty rate was staggering. Jeline flew 3 or 4 missions a day, sometimes more, and every time she landed, she could see the exhaustion etched into the faces of the ground crews, the medics, the grunts who came back from patrol with 1,000-yard stares and blood on their boots. It was during this deployment that Jeline started breaking rules. Small ones at first, extending her loiter time beyond fuel margins, pushing her aircraft harder than the maintenance logs recommended. But gradually, the violations became more serious. She began ignoring orders to return to base when ground commanders called for support, choosing instead to stay on station until the situation was resolved. She developed a reputation for being difficult, for arguing with mission planners, for flying profiles that made her superiors nervous. There were meetings, counseling sessions, written reprimands. Jeline absorbed it all with a stoic silence that infuriated her commanding officer. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just kept flying, because the alternative was unthinkable. The alternative was leaving people to die, while she followed orders that were written by someone sitting in an air-conditioned office 1,000 miles away. The turning point came on a mission over the Pech River Valley. A platoon from the 10th Mountain Division had walked into an ambush, pinned down in a dry riverbed with casualties mounting and no clear route to extraction. Jeline was the closest air support, but she was already low on fuel, her A-10 having burned through reserves during an earlier engagement. The controller at Bagram ordered her to return to base, promising that another aircraft would be dispatched. Jeline looked at her fuel gauge, did the math in her head, and made a choice. She switched off her transponder, changed frequencies, and dove into the valley. For the next hour, she flew a mission that would later be described by a Pentagon analyst as tactically insane and morally imperative. She made run after run, expending every weapon on her aircraft, and when the weapons were gone, she continued to orbit, using her presence to suppress enemy fire through sheer intimidation. When her fuel reached critical levels, she didn't leave. She stayed until a medevac helicopter arrived, until every wounded soldier was loaded, until the platoon was clear. She landed at Bagram on fumes, the engine sputtering as she taxied to the pad. Her commanding officer was waiting. He chewed her out for 20 minutes, his face red, his voice hoarse. Jeline stood at attention and took it. When he was finished, he told her she was grounded pending an investigation. She nodded, saluted, and walked away. 3 days later, the platoon leader she'd saved showed up at her barracks. He was a captain, young, with a bandage wrapped around his head and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway. Then he held out his hand. In his palm was a challenge coin, the kind officers give to soldiers as a token of respect. Jeline stared at it. "I don't need that," she said quietly. The captain smiled, a sad, tired smile. "I know, but I do." He pressed the coin into her hand and left. Jeline looked down at the metal circle, warm from his grip, and felt the walls inside her crack just a little. The investigation cleared her of criminal wrongdoing, but recommended she be reassigned to non-combat duties. Her commanding officer fought the recommendation, arguing that Jeline's instincts and skills were too valuable to waste on training missions. The bureaucracy ground slowly, and in the meantime, Jeline kept flying. The next deployment, the next valley, the next desperate call for help. And somewhere along the way, the legend began. Stories spread. Pilots in other squadrons started requesting her by name. Ground commanders asked if Reaper was available. The Air Force brass didn't like it. Heroes were supposed to be clean-cut and media-friendly, not insubordinate mavericks with disciplinary files thicker than their service records. But they couldn't deny results. Jeline's missions had a success rate that defied statistics. People lived because she flew. It was that simple and that complicated. Now, in the aftermath of the SEAL rescue, the machinery of military justice ground into motion once more. Jeline was summoned to Bagram for a formal inquiry. She flew in on a transport, her A-10 grounded pending the outcome. The hearing was held in a windowless conference room that smelled of stale coffee and old regrets. 3 officers sat behind a long table, their expressions neutral, their questions pointed. They walked her through the mission, second by second. Why had she diverted from her assigned route? Why had she engaged without authorization? Why had she put herself and her aircraft at risk for a team that had other support options inbound? Jeline answered each question with the same measured calm she used over the radio, because they needed help, because the other options were too far away, because it was the right thing to do. The officers exchanged glances. The right thing to do wasn't a sanctioned justification in the Air Force manual. The hearing lasted 4 hours. When it was over, Jeline was dismissed and told to await their decision. She walked out into the blinding Afghan sun, exhausted, drained, feeling the weight of 13 years of service pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She didn't know what she would do if they grounded her permanently. Flying wasn't just her job. It was the only thing that made sense anymore, the only thing that justified the nightmares and the scars and the walls she'd built inside herself. She walked to the flight line, stood in the shadow of an A-10 that wasn't hers, and stared up at the aircraft's scarred fuselage. Someone had painted a small inscription under the cockpit, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Return with honor. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what honor felt like. 2 days later, Lieutenant Keene found her. He'd pulled strings, called in favors, tracked her down with the single-minded determination of a man on a mission. He found her in the chow hall, sitting alone in a corner, picking at a tray of food she had no intention of eating. He approached slowly, respectfully, and when she looked up, he saw exhaustion in her eyes that went deeper than physical fatigue. Captain Kestrel, she nodded, wary. I'm Marcus Keene, Viper 2-1. You saved my team. Jalene's expression didn't change. Just doing my job. Keene sat down across from her, uninvited but undeterred. I heard you might be facing disciplinary action. I want you to know my entire team is willing to testify on your behalf, whatever you need. She shook her head. That's not how this works. The brass doesn't care about testimony. They care about rules. Then the rules are broken, Keene said, his voice hard. Jalene looked at him for a long moment and something in her gaze softened. Yeah. They are. Keene reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, placing it on the table between them. It was the challenge coin from the platoon leader, the one Jalene had kept in her flight suit pocket for 3 years. Keene had brought 6 more, one from each member of his team. They lay on the table like offerings, small circles of metal that represented something larger than gratitude. We're not the first team you've saved, Keene said. I've been asking around. There are stories about you all over this base. Marines in Helmand, Rangers in Kandahar, an entire convoy in Fallujah. You keep showing up when no one else will. Jalene stared at the coins. I also keep getting written up. Keene smiled. Yeah, that's what heroes do. They break rules because the rules weren't written for the situations they find themselves in. He stood, gave her a crisp salute, and walked away. Jalene sat in the empty chow hall, surrounded by the metallic proof of lives saved, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, but maybe something close. Maybe the faint outline of purpose in a world that had stopped making sense. The inquiry board delivered its verdict a week later. Captain Jalene Kestrel was officially reprimanded for unauthorized deviation from flight plan and violation of engagement protocols. She was also being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions above and beyond the call of duty. The two decisions existed in tension, a bureaucratic paradox that captured everything contradictory about modern warfare. She could be punished and honored simultaneously, a hero and a problem, an asset and a liability. Jalene accepted both with the same stoic silence. The medal ceremony was held at Bagram, a small affair attended mostly by her squadron mates and a handful of ground personnel who had heard the stories. The base commander pinned the medal to her chest, said a few words about courage and dedication, and shook her hand. Jalene stood at attention, her face impassive, her thoughts elsewhere. She was thinking about the 6 SEALs in the valley, about the platoon in the Petch, about every desperate voice that had crackled through her headset asking for help. The medal was for them, not her. After the ceremony, Jalene's squadron threw a party in her honor at the base bar, a cramped wooden structure that smelled of beer and diesel fuel. They toasted her, told exaggerated versions of the SEAL rescue, and ribbed her about finally getting recognition from the brass. Jalene smiled, participated, played her part. But inside, she felt hollow. Recognition didn't erase the disciplinary file. It didn't make the nightmares go away. It didn't change the fact that the Air Force saw her as a risk, a loose cannon to be managed rather than trusted. She drank her beer, laughed at the jokes, and slipped out early, walking back to her quarters under a sky so full of stars it hurt to look at. Somewhere out there, beyond the wire, there were people who needed help, and she was grounded, at least temporarily, unable to reach them. The thought was unbearable. But the story doesn't end with grounding or medals or bureaucratic ambivalence. It ends, or rather continues, in the way these stories always do, with ripples spreading outward, touching lives in ways impossible to predict. Lieutenant Keene returned to the States and was promoted to commander of his own SEAL platoon. He kept Jalene's coin on his desk, used her story as a teaching tool for his men. Never leave anyone behind. Never assume help isn't coming. Never forget that sometimes one person, in the right place at the right time, can change everything. Other pilots heard the story and started flying differently, started questioning orders that didn't make tactical sense, started prioritizing the lives on the ground over the comfort of commanders in the rear. The legend of Reaper grew, evolved, became something larger than Jeline herself. And that was fine with her, because legends didn't have to live with the reality. Legends didn't wake up at 3 in the morning hearing the sound of the GAU-8, feeling the G-forces of a hard bank, remembering the faces of the men they'd killed to save the men they'd saved. Jeline was eventually cleared to fly again, but with restrictions. She was assigned to training duties at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, teaching the next generation of A-10 pilots how to deliver close air support with precision and restraint. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was supposed to teach restraint, the virtue she'd been reprimanded for lacking, but she embraced the role with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Her students were intimidated by her at first, this quiet, scarred woman with a chest full of medals and a reputation that bordered on mythical. But they learned quickly that she wasn't interested in hero worship. She was interested in making sure they survived, and more importantly, that the people depending on them survived. She taught them to read terrain, to anticipate enemy movements, to calculate fuel margins with brutal honesty. She taught them that the manual was a guideline, not gospel, and that sometimes the most important decisions were the ones you made alone, in the cockpit, with lives hanging in the balance. One of her students, a young lieutenant named Kira Vance, asked her once about the SEAL rescue. They were in the debriefing room after a training sortie, just the two of them, the desert sun filtering through the blinds in dusty bars of light. "Captain, is it true you went in alone? No wingman, no backup?" Jeline looked at her, considering the question. "Yes." "Why?" Jeline was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost inaudible. "Because no one else was there. And because I knew what it felt like to wait for help that never came." Kira frowned. "When did you wait for help?" Jeline didn't answer. She gathered her notes, dismissed the lieutenant, and walked out into the Nevada heat. But Kira was persistent, and she did her research. She dug through old deployment records, cross-referenced mission logs, and eventually found the answer. 5 years before the SEAL rescue, Jeline had been part of a two-ship formation over Helmand Province. Her wingman had been shot down by ground fire, the pilot trapped in the wreckage, still alive. Jeline had called for combat search and rescue, had orbited the crash site for 40 minutes, fending off insurgents with what little ammunition she had left. But the rescue helicopter was delayed, and by the time it arrived, the wingman was dead. Jeline had flown back to base alone, and she had never flown with a wingman again. She requested solo missions exclusively, citing tactical flexibility, but everyone knew the truth. She couldn't bear to lose another partner. The revelation changed how Kira saw her instructor. Jeline wasn't just a legend or a cautionary tale. She was someone carrying a weight that would have crushed most people, and she was doing it alone because that's what she believed she deserved. Kira tried to talk to her about it once, approached her after class with carefully chosen words about trauma and support and the importance of not isolating yourself. Jeline listened politely, thanked her for the concern, and shut the conversation down with a finality that left no room for argument. She didn't need therapy. She didn't need understanding. She needed to keep flying, keep teaching, keep making sure that no one else had to wait for help that never came. It was the only way she knew how to live. Years passed. Jeline's reputation solidified. She became an institution at Nellis, the instructor every pilot wanted but also feared. She pushed her students hard, demanded perfection, accepted nothing less than total commitment. Some washed out, unable to meet her standards. Others thrived, graduating with skills that exceeded anything they'd imagined possible. And a few, the rare few, saw past the legend to the person underneath. The woman who still flinched at loud noises, who sometimes stood on the flight line at sunset staring at the mountains as if searching for something lost in the distance. Those students didn't pity her. Pity was the last thing Jeline would have wanted. but they understood in the way people understand things that can't be spoken, that heroism isn't clean or simple. It's messy and costly, and it leaves scars that never fully heal. Then on a cold morning in November, 15 years after the SEAL rescue, Jeline received a package. No return address, just her name and the base. Inside was a black and white photograph, slightly faded, showing 6 men standing in front of a memorial wall. They were older now, grayer, but still recognizable. On the back of the photo, someone had written 6 names in a single sentence. "We never forgot." Jeline stared at the photo for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't cry. She had trained herself not to cry, had built walls too strong for tears to breach. But something inside those walls shifted, cracked, let in a sliver of light. She placed the photograph on her desk next to the challenge coins and went back to work. Because that's what she did. She kept going, kept flying, kept teaching. Not for glory or recognition, but because somewhere out there, someone might need help. And she couldn't bear the thought of not being ready when that call came. The story could end here, with Jeline at Nellie's, quietly training pilots, living a life of purpose if not peace. But stories like this don't have endings. They have continuations, echoes that ripple forward through time. One of Jeline's students, now a captain herself, would fly a mission over Syria that saved a downed helicopter crew. She would credit her training, credit the lessons learned from a scarred instructor who taught her that presence mattered as much as firepower. Another student would become an advocate for reforming close air support protocols, pushing for policies that gave pilots more autonomy in critical situations. He would cite Jeline's case during congressional hearings, arguing that sometimes rules needed to bend to accommodate reality. And Lieutenant Keene, now a retired admiral, would write a memoir about his military career. An entire chapter would be devoted to the valley, to the desperate wait, to the sound of an A-10 roaring overhead when all hope seemed lost. He would call it The Day the Reaper Came, and it would become required reading at the Naval Academy. Jeline never read the memoir. She avoided publicity, declined interviews, refused to participate in documentary projects that wanted to tell her story. She wasn't being modest. She just didn't see the point. The story wasn't about her. It was about the men and women on the ground, the ones who fought and bled and died while people like her circled overhead. She was just a tool, a weapon wielded by necessity, and tools didn't deserve adulation. They deserved maintenance, upkeep, and eventual retirement. She had accepted long ago that her retirement wouldn't be peaceful. The nightmares ensured that. But maybe, if she was lucky,